rig is blowing. The rig is blowing.
The night of April 20th, 2010 is one that will never be forgotten in a hurry. For this was the night when the worst disaster international waters had ever witnessed changed the world forever. Barely 2 hours to midnight, an oil rig exploded into ghoulish flames that incinerated everything in its wake. But what everyone thought to be the worst thing that could happen turned out to be just the beginning of a cataclysmic tragedy that would continue to ravage the world till today. This is the story of the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill, the largest marine oil spill in world history. The Gulf of Mexico is every oil driller's dream. The region alone provides the United States with more than 1/5 of all its oil and gas needs, according to the United States Energy Information Administration. Needless to say, there is an overabundance of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and that is why oil companies trip over themselves trying to set up their oil rigs in this region. Everyone wants their share of the black gold that has become the lifeblood of our global economy. It's not quite clear why the Gulf of Mexico is so rich in oil. The best geologists can tell us is that the conditions are just perfect over there for the production of oil. Millions of years ago, before there was a Mexico or Gulf of Mexico, ancient plants and animals inhabited the region. However, all living organisms die according to the circle of life. So these plants and animals eventually died off, leaving their remains trapped underground. Soon, heat and pressure stepped in and began to work on these decomposing molecules. Simultaneously, the forces decomposed, and now dead organic matter into hydrocarbons, which, according to chemistry, provides the source material for oil and gas. As oil and gas started to form under the earth of the region we've come to know as the Gulf of Mexico, they accumulated in underground rocks. Specifically, the oil and gas molecules seeped into the cracks and pockets between the layers of rock and made their home there for thousands of years before humans came on the scene. When humans finally arrived, they discovered these underground packets of oil, which they called pay zones. They then built multi-billion-dollar companies to drill and explore these pay zones for oil. Today, statistics show that energy companies have drilled over 2,000 wells in the Gulf of Mexico. One of such companies is BP, the oil company involved in the oil spill disaster of the Gulf of Mexico. BP used to be known as the British Petroleum Company Limited. Now it is simply known as BP, one of the wealthiest and largest oil companies in the world. As a matter of fact, BP is the fourth largest investor-owned oil company in the world after ExxonMobil, Shell, and Total Energies. An impressive feat considering that many were almost certain that the disaster of April 2010 would mark the end for this company. 2001 was the year that BP started to set its sights on the Gulf of Mexico, the land flowing with oil and gas. Producing oil at this site was going to be a massive project, so BP made big plans. The Gulf of Mexico was the big leagues. First, the company needed the most sophisticated oil drilling rig it could find. After doing its due diligence, BP decided on the Deepwater Horizon rig, so it reached out and leased the rig from Transocean, the world's biggest oil rig contractor. In the world of oil drilling and exploration, one could say that Deepwater Horizon was the Titanic of the industry. Huge, sophisticated, and at the time thought to be a miracle of drilling. If any machine could bring BP's dreams to life, the Deepwater Horizon was it. The contract was scheduled to expire in September 2013. Deepwater Horizon was a beast of a machine. It cost about $560 million to build and boasted staggering dimensions of 396 feet in length and 256 feet in width. On top of that, the rig could drill down as far as 30,000 feet and could operate on waters as deep as 8,000 feet. For context, the oil well BP was looking to drill was barely 5,000 feet below sea and only extended 18,000 feet into the rock. Besides, the name behind the rig was synonymous with safety, as Transocean had been reputed to have a strong overall safety record, according to popular narratives at the time. The disaster of April 20th, 2010 would later bring many hidden things to the fore. However, for now it's safe to say that the Deepwater Horizon was more than sufficient for BP's purposes on every single count. Up to this point, as far as BP could see, nothing could possibly go wrong. Next, BP needed trained and experienced hands to man this rig. Halliburton wasn't new to the business at all, and so BP requested its services. After agreeing on rates and terms, Halliburton provided scores of skilled personnel to help man the rig and carry out the exploration. The staff of Halliburton had their work cut out for them. It was challenging work, as you'd assume, but it wasn't anything any of these men weren't already used to. But to simplify, let's go over what a typical oil production process looks like offshore. Naturally, there are several different methods, but the method that BP chose involved 2 steps. The first step was to drill into the oil well at the Macondo Prospect. The Macondo Prospect was the name BP gave to the area of the Gulf of Mexico where they had purchased mineral rights to drill. Now, as the rig would drill into the oil well, it would eventually reach the oil reservoir and strike oil. When that happened, BP planned to cap the well column with 3 cement plugs, and then use a different rig to remove the oil from the well at a later time. The first step, which involved the cementing of the well, was what BP hired Halliburton Inc. to do. But unknown to BP, this first step would become the only step it would take in its oil drilling plans at the Gulf of Mexico. The second half of its mission would never become a reality because, though no one knew it at the time, catastrophe was already lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When April 20th, 2010 came around, the Deepwater Horizon had 126 people on board. Among them were 79 Transocean employees, 7 BP employees, and 40 contract workers. Ironically, among the crew on the rig that fateful night were execs from both BP and Transocean who had come to congratulate the senior staff of the rig for 7 years of operation without a lost time incident. But sometimes the universe picks a random day to have a good laugh at humanity's expense, and that day was one of such days. Survivors of the disaster say it all started at about 9:56 p.m. Like a textbook horror movie, the flickering of lights was the first giveaway that tragedy loomed. Soon after the flickering lights announced its presence, trouble arrived in the form of 2 powerful vibrations that hit the rig. It was at that time that the crew knew that something was wrong. Sadly, before the crew could collect their thoughts and realize what had hit them, the explosion hit. The fire that followed that explosion was bigger than anything the crew had ever seen. In the blink of an eye, the entire platform had been consumed by the fire, and the fire would go on to burn for more than 24 hours until the Deepwater Horizon finally sank on April 22nd. Of the 126 on board, 11 were presumed dead from the fire, while about 90-something others were severely injured. Catastrophically, this was to be but the first half of the disaster at the Gulf of Mexico. While chaos reigned on deck, underwater a far worse catastrophe that the world still hasn't recovered from was afoot. Oil, or more correctly, a flood of oil, to rival the biblical flood of Noah's time, was spilling out of the oil well and into the Gulf. When BP reported the incident, it mentioned that the total amount of oil lost in the oil spill was 1,000 barrels per day. However, when the U.S. government officials conducted their own research, they found that the volume of oil that spilled was astronomically more, 60,000 barrels every day for 87 days straight. Altogether, the total discharge was estimated at 210 million U.S. gallons, more than 300 Olympic-sized swimming pools of oil, and yet as at early 2012, there were reports that the well at the Macondo Prospect was still leaking. The ecological damage of the oil spill was as bad as you could possibly imagine, and then much worse. All efforts made to clean up the mess was like trying to dry the ocean with a flimsy household mop. Environmental first responders tried everything from spraying dispersants on the oil to break it up, to setting up controlled fires, to surrounding the oil with floating booms to contain the spread. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, BP tried its best to cap the well. Thrice, the company did its best to close the well, but all attempts failed. The well eventually had to be declared sealed on September 19, 2010, but by then, the damage had already been done. Everything from the oil spill itself to the cleanup efforts worked together to cause extensive damage to marine and wildlife habitats, as well as fishing and tourism activities on the Gulf. In fact, 3 days after the spill, oil cleanup crews still had to work 4 days a week to attempt to clean up oil from the Macondo Prospect that had made its way into the waters of the Florida Panhandle and Tampa Bay. Florida is about a 9-hour drive from the Gulf of Mexico. Anyone who heard about the Deepwater Horizon disaster ultimately had one big question on their minds. How did this happen? The answer to that question dates back to a few months before the event. The mishmash of contractors and subcontractors BP had hired to work on the rig didn't help matters either. The first mistake happened a few months before the disaster. Halliburton had reached out to BP with some news. For the oil exploration at the Macondo Prospect, Halliburton had been hired to make the first drill into the oil well and then cap it with cement. After this first half, a smaller, inexpensive rig would take over and begin the oil production proper. But when Halliburton ran its tests, it found that the cement to be used was highly unstable. If the crew was to use that cement to cap the oil wells, oil and gas would be able to seep out through the pores in the cement and into the well. Obviously, this would easily create the perfect conditions for disaster. Upon discovering this, Halliburton passed the report on to BP, but shockingly, BP decided to go ahead regardless, a damning insight into the company culture that prevailed at BP. By midnight of April 20th, the cementing was done, but just to be sure, the representatives from Halliburton and BP double-checked to make sure that the cement wasn't putting too much pressure on the well and causing oil to seep out. So far, everything was A-OK, and all that was left now was the final step, detaching Deepwater Horizon from the well so a smaller rig could take over. Everyone had to be super careful now. This was make or break time. As expected, the crew conducted their positive and negative pressure tests just to make sure once again that no gas had leaked into the well. This time, the test, specifically the negative pressure test, came back negative. Unfortunately, the crew misinterpreted the result, and so at 8 p.m., when they concluded that everything was great, gaseous hydrocarbons had already started to leak into the well. When gaseous hydrocarbons seep into an oil well, they start to kick. That is, they rapidly start to expand and rise up the pipe from the well into the rig. To prevent this kick from happening, a blowout preventer is usually installed on the pipes, and to their credit, the crew on Deepwater Horizon closed the preventer, but to their misfortune, they did it too late. Having seeped into the well, the molecules rushed through the pipe with increasing speed until they forcefully spewed out of the pipe and onto the floor of the rig. It took only a few minutes for large areas of the rig to be covered in gaseous hydrocarbons. All that was left now was a cataclysmic spark. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe it was a spark from onboard equipment, but the spark finally arrived. And from one tiny spark, a blast that mimicked that of a nuclear bomb explosion erupted. The fire raged on for more than 24 hours. 72 hours later, and 11 workers still hadn't been found. These ones finally had to be declared dead. Others who survived had harrowing stories to tell as they nursed their ghastly wounds. Shortly after, Deepwater Horizon would sink, damaging the pipe that linked the oil rig to the oil well in the process. This sinking would be what eventually led to the endless oil spill at the Gulf. Like a cosmic joke, the day Deepwater Horizon went under happened to be Earth Day, a day when we celebrate and promote environmental protection. More than 10 years after the spill, the scientists are admitting that they are just now able to realize the true impact of the oil spill at the Gulf of Mexico. But what's worse is that most of the safety rules that were enacted after the disaster have now been rolled back. BP ended up paying billions in penalties, but the Gulf of Mexico has returned to the wild, wild west that it's always been for energy companies. Oil drilling has long since resumed like nothing happened, and as we speak, there's nothing keeping us from an encore of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010. If you found this video interesting, then don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to bring this video to more people. Also, make sure to check out the channel for more interesting disaster stories.